Hello, my name is Truman Pippert, and I'm a Nebraska State Executive for Generation Connection. Today I'll be speaking with you about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. With information from History.com. So who was Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, he was a social activist and Baptist minister who played a key role in the American Civil Rights Movement from the mid-1950s until his assassination in 1968. He sought equality and human rights for African Americans, the economically disadvantaged, and all victims of injustice via peaceful protest. He was the driving force behind watershed events such as the Montgomery bus boycott and the 1963 March on Washington, which helped bring about such landmark legislation as the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. King was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964 and is remembered each day on Martin Luther King Jr. Day, a federal holiday since 1986. He was born on January 15, 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, and was the second child of Martin Luther King Sr., a pastor, and Alberta Williams King, a former schoolteacher. Along with his older sister Christine and younger brother Alfred Daniel Williams, he grew up in the city's Sweet Auburn neighborhood, which was then home to some of the most prominent and prosperous African Americans in the country. A gifted student, he attended segregated public schools and at the age of 15 was admitted to Morehouse College, the alma mater of both his father and maternal grandfather, where he then studied medicine and law. Although he hadn't intended to follow in his father's footsteps by joining the ministry, he changed his mind under the mentorship of Morehouse's president, Dr. Benjamin Mays, an influential theologian and outspoken advocate for racial equality. After graduating in 1948, King entered Crozer Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, where he earned a Bachelor of Divinity degree, won a prestigious fellowship, and was elected president of his predominantly white senior class. He then enrolled in a graduate program at Boston University, completed his coursework in 1953, and earned a doctorate in systematic theology 2 years later. While in Boston, he met Coretta Scott, a young singer from Alabama who was studying at the New England Conservatory of Music. The couple wed in 1953 and settled in Montgomery, Alabama, where King became pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. They had 4 children: Yolanda Denise King, Martin Luther King III, Dexter Scott King, and Bernice Albertine King. The King family had been living in Montgomery for less than a year when the highly segregated city became the epicenter of the burgeoning struggle for civil rights in America, galvanized by the landmark Brown v. Board of Education decision of 1954. On December 1, 1955, Rosa Parks, secretary of the local chapter of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, refused to give up her seat to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus and was arrested. Activists coordinated a bus boycott that would continue for 381 days. The Montgomery bus boycott placed a severe economic strain on the public transit system and downtown business owners. They charged Martin Luther King Jr. as the protest leader and official spokesman. By the time the Supreme Court ruled segregating seating on public buses unconstitutional in November of 1956, King, highly influenced by Gandhi and the activist Bayard Rustin, had entered the national spotlight as an inspirational proponent of organized, nonviolent resistance. He had also become a target for white supremacists who firebombed his family home that January. Emboldened by the success of the Montgomery bus boycott in 1957, he and other civil rights activists, most of them fellow ministers, founded the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a group committed to achieving full equality for African Americans through nonviolent protest. In 1960, King and his family moved to Atlanta, his native city, where he joined his father as co-pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church. The new position did not stop King and his SCLC colleagues from becoming key players in many of the most significant civil rights battles of the 1960s. Their philosophy of nonviolence was to put a particularly severe test during the Birmingham campaign of 1963, in which activists used to boycott, sit-ins, and marches to protest segregation, unfair hiring practices, and other injustices in one of America's most racially divided cities. Arrested for his involvement on April 12th, King penned the Civil Rights Manifesto, known as the Letter from Birmingham Jail, an eloquent defense of civil disobedience addressed to a group of white clergymen who had criticized his tactics. Later that year, Martin Luther King Jr. worked with a number of civil rights and religious groups to organize the March on Washington for Jobs on Freedom, a peaceful political rally designed to shed light on the injustices Black Americans continued to face across the country. Held on August 28th and attended by some 200,000 to 300,000 participants, the event is widely regarded as a watershed moment in the history of the American Civil Rights Movement and a factor in the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The March on Washington culminated in King's most famous address, known as the I Have a Dream speech, a spirited call for peace and equality that many consider a masterpiece of rhetoric. Standing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, a monument to the president who, a century earlier, had brought down the institution of slavery in the United States, he shared his vision of a future in which, quote, "This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The speech and march cemented King's reputation at home and abroad. Later that year, he was named Man of the Year by Time magazine, and in 1964 became, at the time, the youngest person ever awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. In the spring of 1965, King's elevated profile drew international attention to the violence that erupted between white segregationists and peaceful demonstrators in Selma, Alabama, where the SCLC and Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had organized a voter registration campaign. Captured on television, the brutal scene outraged many Americans and inspired supporters from across the country to gather in Alabama and take part in the Selma to Montgomery March, led by King and supported by President Lyndon B. Johnson, who sent in federal troops to keep the peace. That August, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act, which guaranteed the right to vote, first awarded by the 15th Amendment, to all African Americans. The events in Selma deepened a growing rift between Martin Luther King Jr. and young radicals who repudiated his nonviolent methods and commitment to working within the established political framework. As more militant black leaders such as Stokely Carmichael rose to prominence, King broadened the scope of his activism to address issues such as the Vietnam War and poverty among Americans of all races. In 1967, King and the SCLC embarked on an ambitious program known as the Poor People's Campaign, which was to include a massive march on the Capitol. On the evening of April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. He was fatally shot while standing on the balcony of a hotel in Memphis, where King had traveled to support a sanitation workers' strike. In the wake of his death, a wave of riots swept major cities across the country, while President Johnson declared a national day of mourning. James Earl Ray, an escaped convict and known racist, pleaded guilty to the murder and was sentenced to 99 years in prison. He later recanted his confession and gained some unlikely advocates, including members of the King family, before his death in 1998. Thank you.